If you'd like to follow along, our scripture reading this morning will be from Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21. Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21. Apostle Paul writes, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good."
Thinking about these verses that Gary just spoke of out of Romans chapter 12, it makes me think about the strong sense of justice that a lot of us have, right? When someone does something wrong, especially wrong to us, we like to think of ways to serve them justice or to get even, right? When someone takes advantage of us, how do we get back at them? I think we all struggle with that in some sense, but our world encourages that, doesn't it? I heard a lot as a kid, as long as you're not the one that throws the first punch, you can pummel the other guy into the ground, right? It's not illegal till you get caught kind of idea. And my dad taught me those kinds of things, but the world teaches us those kinds of things. We see it online. We see it in the comment sections of people that when someone says something rude, they're always trying to one-up the other person on how they can personally attack them. We see it at work. When a coworker does something you don't like, you try to intentionally sabotage them to get back at them. These are the kind of things that the world encourages and teaches. But as we look back in the Sermon on the Mount, if you'd like to turn back over there with me in chapter 5 of Matthew, Jesus is calling his disciples to something radically different. He's teaching us to approach evil, when people do evil to us, to approach it differently, to change how we view retaliation or revenge, right? So instead of asking, what do these people deserve when they've done evil to us, or something like, how can I get back at them, Jesus wants us to instead reject retaliation, because as we've looked at this whole time, his kingdom isn't built on things like revenge. So we'll be reading in Matthew chapter 5, like I said, if you want to turn back over there. We'll be starting in verse 38 in just a moment. But I want us to challenge ourselves to reject our natural desire for revenge and to instead respond to evil with mercy, generosity, and love. And I think we'll see that in the examples that Jesus brings out today. But along with the other lessons we've looked at so far, at least the past couple, Jesus starts by reminding us of what the law says. And he says in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Now Jesus is reminding us of what the Old Testament law taught in how to deal with revenge or retaliation when someone would do something against you. Now, there's plenty of passages in the Old Testament that talk about this, but one of the most clear and concise ones is found in the book of Leviticus. And over in Leviticus 24, specifically in verses 19 through 20, the writer says, "If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. So Jesus is teaching this old school idea that really was all over the world at that time, called lex talionis, which basically meant an eye for an eye. If someone harms you in some way, you harm them the exact same. You get even, essentially. Now, this was done in a judicial or a court system, but the thing that I want you to notice, because I think a lot of us interpret this wrongly, is that this law given by God was actually merciful. Because what it prevented is it prevented people from getting revenge in a way that measured more than what the other person did to them. Right? Because oftentimes we're not asking, what can I do exactly the same way to them? We're asking, how can I get back at them in a bigger and better way? Right? If someone steals your lunch out of the fridge at work, well, I'm going to go slash their tires. Now, do you think it's a bigger deal to steal somebody's lunch or slash their tires? Well, it's obvious, right? But that's the kind of thing that we do to people. Some of you are shaking your heads. No. Others, I think, get it. But the idea here is that the law is teaching actually to be merciful because it is limiting the personal measure of judgment that you can take against other people. So God gave it actually probably to be merciful. And I think that we see this in other passages of the law. Because see, the Old Testament is not just this entire collection of books where it's this angry, vengeful, wrathful guy sitting in the clouds that's ready to smite you like some people think it is. But actually, the Old Testament deals so much with love and mercy and goodness. Listen to some of the passages that come out of the very same book. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 17 through 18. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. See, God is saying that you shall love your neighbor. You shall have mercy. You shouldn't take personal vengeance on him. And so I think the idea of this whole eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, fracture for fracture idea is there is consequences for doing evil. There's always consequences. Even in the New Testament, there are consequences for doing wrong. But that doesn't mean that there isn't mercy. See, God is a God of mercy and of justice equally. And so Jesus is reminding us of this. And we see that Jesus is going to continue to show the boundaries of the law as he's done before, but he's going to go beyond those boundaries to teach us what the heart of God actually desires. And I think we understand this, don't we? Because when we looked at the passages on anger, he said anybody that murders is guilty, but don't be angry with your brother. Anyone who commits adultery is guilty, but don't even lust. Right? He says things like this, and it's the same thing here. There is a boundary that God set up, but the heart of God extends beyond those boundaries to show what really pleases him. So Jesus does the same thing with revenge here, and he's going to use 4 examples to teach us how he wants us to respond. Now, I do need to preface this, because I think there's this false idea out in the world today of Christianity, where people think that Christians just have to be a doormat. Christians just have to intentionally become the victim, the people that seek for others to persecute them. And that's not the idea at all. I think if we look at Jesus, we don't see Jesus as a doormat. I think if we look at people like Paul, we don't see Paul as someone who intentionally sought being a victim. Now, did terrible things come their way? Absolutely they did. But Jesus didn't go out looking for people to stone him. Paul didn't go out looking for Roman persecution. It just so happened to come their way as they were preaching their message. And so I don't think Christianity teaches us to be a doormat, a victim, or to be taken advantage of, but rather the teaching in Christianity is when those things do happen, do not return evil for evil, but as Gary said this morning in the book of Romans, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And so that is the teaching that Jesus is going to give us here. It's really, when you think about it, a new way of thinking. Not being retaliatory or holding a grudge against somebody. Jesus is teaching us how to deal with people that serve evil to us. And I will be honest with you, this is one of the most difficult lessons so far. So as we get into these next couple examples that Jesus uses, keep that in mind. Now, Jesus begins this next section with something that we're probably familiar with, which is turning the other cheek. In verse 39 of Matthew chapter 5, he says, "But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Now, this is a very familiar passage for probably all of us. Even non-Christians have heard of this principle at the very least. Jesus is saying, if someone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. Now, does this mean that Jesus literally wants you to get slapped and then say, hey, please give me another one on the other side? I don't think so. But does that situation actually come up sometimes in life? Do people slap other people? Yes, they do. In fact, I think we've seen it maybe in TV shows or movies where a guy will do something that makes a girl that he's seeing upset. She slaps him in public, walks out of the restaurant, and then he's left there to be embarrassed, right? These things actually do happen from time to time. But I think the lesson here that Jesus is teaching us is if someone insults you or embarrasses you, don't return the same insult. Don't return an insult that's equal or greater, or even lesser for the people that actually need to hear that. But the idea back in the day, and this is kind of interesting, the idea back in the day is if someone backhanded you on your right cheek, that was actually more insulting than it would be to be backhanded on the other cheek. Now, however you want to figure out that actually working and which hand they have to slap each other with, and that we're not talking about that today. But the idea here is if someone offends you greatly, don't retaliate. Let them still continue to offend you, basically, but don't retaliate against them. You do not return evil for evil. Return evil with good. So Jesus is teaching us in this lesson to not return insult. And so we've talked about some examples of that, right? If a customer belittles you, you don't belittle the customer. If someone mocks your faith online in the comments section, you don't go tell them how stupid they are for believing in atheism or whatever other religion it is. If someone cuts you off in traffic, you don't raise up the finger that we're all thinking about, right? And then continue to try to road rage your way in front of them and cut them off. The idea here is we don't return insult for insult, right? So Jesus gives us a pretty clear-cut example here, at least in his first example. Now, this one's a little bit more difficult because Jesus brings up the idea of being sued. He says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 40, "If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak also." Now, this idea is a little bit lost on us as Americans because we have more than we need. And so the idea here is that a tunic would be your inner clothes, right? That your everyday clothes, let's say your t-shirt. And your cloak would be your outer garment. Think like a heavy coat, so to speak, right? And most people, even if you were dirt poor in those days, would have at least a tunic or more. Inner garment, right? Your daily clothes, your work clothes, so to speak. But usually, you had to be pretty wealthy to have more than one cloak, more than one outer garment. And God tells us in the law that you actually could not take somebody's cloak for more than a day because it was what they needed to cover themselves at night. It was almost like a blanket, right? And so he's saying that if you do that and they cry out against you, I will hear and I will be compassionate, he says in the book of Exodus. And so here, Jesus is speaking to people who actually understand what that's like. Now, we miss this a little bit because as Americans, we're like, well, I don't know what I'm going to wear today. I've got 5 different dress shirts and all these different colored dress pants, and I could wear a coat, but I probably won't, right? This idea is lost on us a little bit, but to them, they would have understood. And so for someone to say, well, yeah, don't just take my clothes, take my coat too, that's incredibly difficult. And how many of us would actually do that? If someone sued you and said, yeah, give me what you owe me for what you did, or even if they sued you wrongfully, which is really the idea here, and said, give me what you owe, how many of us would say, oh yeah, well, take this too. Let me give you more than you're asking. I mean, that's just ridiculous, right? Who does that? And I think especially as Americans, we say, well, I have rights. So first of all, you're not going to sue me, and if you are going to sue me, I'm going to bury you 6 feet deep when all things are said and done. This is a hard teaching for us as Americans to say, yeah, when you sue me, why don't you go ahead and take all this other stuff too? It's a difficult teaching. Now, in practicality, what does this really look like? Well, I think it's difficult, but I think maybe some examples is if a neighbor destroys your property, right? They did something to wrong you, and you have to pay them back saying, well, don't worry about backing over my fence. I'll take care of it. Now, how many of us would actually do that? Probably not very many. I know that I would struggle with that for sure. What about if someone in your family dies that is of great influence and they have an inheritance? Right? Children fight over inheritances all the time. And you say, well, you're not getting that much of the share of mom and dad's inheritance. No way. But how many of us would say, you know what? I'm really not that worried about it. You need it more than I do. This is a difficult teaching. I'm not saying I fully understand it or fully know how to apply it to my life, but nonetheless, it is a difficult teaching. So Jesus's point, or the lesson that he's teaching us, is to be at peace and have generosity with our offender over possessions. See, peace and generosity are far more important with people that offend us than it is our possessions. And I think that that's what Jesus is teaching us. So however we want to apply that to our lives, I think that that's the important principle here. Jesus, in his third example, says that if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now again, this concept is a little bit lost on us as Americans, but I'm sure you've heard this example before. The Romans could force any citizen under Roman authority to carry their gear for a Roman mile. Now, a Roman mile is a little bit less than a mile in America. It's like 9.9 something. But the idea here is that if you're just traveling along the road, a Roman soldier can come up and say, hey, that stuff that I need, you're going to carry it for a mile. And okay, well, I have to, because that's the way that things worked under Roman authority. Jesus is teaching if someone does that to you, not only are you obligated to go the mile to obey the law, but you are obligated to go the 2nd mile as well. Now, when was the last time someone insulted you, expected something of you in that insult, and you said, well, let me do more than you're asking? That's a pretty difficult thing, isn't it? Again, I have rights. Who do you think you are? As Americans, this is a very difficult thing. So I think in this lesson, we see that going above and beyond for those who mistreat you is what the key here is, to go above and beyond to serve those who have offended us, and we do it gladly. Jesus doesn't say, be bitter when someone insults you, be bitter and complain about something when someone affects your life in a negative way. In fact, you're going to serve them and you're going to go above and beyond. Now, why do you think Jesus is doing all these things? Why do you think Jesus is teaching us to be totally abnormal? By the way, if you haven't figured it out yet, Christians aren't normal. If we were normal, we wouldn't be doing any of these things. But why do you think Jesus is teaching us to be abnormal? I think it shows people a difference. Because people expect you to retaliate when they insult you. People expect you to try to get even with them or to hurt them even worse when they do something wrong to you. Instead, let's just say someone gets in a car crash. You ram into them from behind, the Christian gets out of their car, and instead of the first thing out of their mouth being swear words and who do you think you are and what do you do and why weren't you paying attention, they say, man, are you okay? I just want to make sure you're okay. Let's try to figure this out together and try to figure out how we can solve this issue. Now, I'm not saying don't report it to your insurance. I'm not telling you to be foolish. I mean, obviously that's not a good idea, but what I'm saying is your approach to being insulted, to being hurt, to having something happen in your life that changes things drastically, they expect you to act the way that the world is going to act. But Jesus is saying to be different. So in a very practical example, there was a video I was watching recently where this guy was at a restaurant, he was a Christian, and they were praying for their meal, and the waitress found out that he was a Christian through that, and so the waitress intentionally gave them bad service. Well, the Christian, when he was finished with his meal, left a $100 tip on the table. And as he was walking out of the restaurant, the waitress runs out to him. And of course, I don't know if this is a true story or not, but you get the point. The waitress runs out to him and she says, "Why would you leave me a $100 tip? I intentionally served you poorly." Intentionally. And the guy said, "I'm a Christian." See, the point is, we don't respond the way that the rest of the world responds. When someone persecutes us, we show them the love of Christ, because after all, that's what Jesus did. And you say, well, how can I do what Jesus did? He was God. Do you remember when Jesus was being mocked and crucified, and they said, "Prophesy to us, Jesus. Who's beating you? Who's mocking on you? Who's spitting on you?" It says that Jesus didn't even open his mouth. And you say, well, he's God. I can't do that. I'm not God. Well, you read the book of Acts and you see people like Stephen, who didn't persecute the people that were stoning him to death. See, Jesus expects us to respond in a different way, and I think that we're starting to understand that here. But the easy thing for us to do is to complain about how much we hate something when someone offends us instead of going the second mile. The easy thing is to do the bare minimum when someone needs our help. And the easy thing to do, maybe you think in a work setting, is to be intentionally inefficient, to do the job worse to get back at someone. That's the easy thing to do. But what is the hard thing to do? The hard thing to do is to love your enemies. And that's what God teaches us. In this fourth and final example, I really struggled to figure out the connection here. Because Jesus says, "Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you." Now, Jesus, in a context of retaliation and revenge, how is this at all connected? How does giving to someone in need, or not refusing to someone that wants to borrow from you, how does that connect to revenge, Jesus? I mean, it doesn't even seem like it connects, yet it's under this whole section of "you have heard it said, but I say to you." And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and then I realized that in my own life, I hadn't been doing such a good job of this. And I'll tell you that the same person that I shared with you a few lessons ago, that referred to my son as cancer when he was still in his mama's belly, their furnace went out in their house not too long ago. They were asking for money on Facebook, and they said, "We don't have the money to fix our furnace. Can you please help us?" And they were just sending out a generic message to everybody, anybody that was willing to help. And I will tell you, in that moment, when I saw that they were asking for that, I was like, there's no way I'm going to help you. Why would I help you? You called my son cancer. I mean, that's like one of the most offensive things you can do to somebody. Why would I help you? So some time goes by, and I'm preparing for this lesson, and I'm like, Jesus, how in the world does this work with revenge? And I will be totally transparent with you. I just started tearing up. Because I realized that I was taking revenge on somebody by doing nothing when they needed help. See, Jesus is calling us to be radically different. There is no lesson in the Sermon on the Mount that's easy. And I've told you before, if you haven't been offended by Jesus yet, you will be. But that's a good thing. And some of you are saying, well, convicted. I am convicted by Jesus. Yeah, but you don't get convicted without being offended. Jesus has to offend your way of life for you to be convicted. Jesus requires us to be totally, radically different people. You are supposed to be abnormal from this world. And sometimes it hurts. But Jesus is asking us to love our enemies. If Jesus could do it, and he's asking us to do it, he's not being unreasonable, I can promise you that. And although it may be difficult, it is worth doing. It is worth loving our enemies. Can you imagine someone that never even gave God a second thought in their life, that because you responded in a way that was totally different than what they expected, that they actually gave God a chance? That they saw something in you that magnified Jesus Christ. Can you imagine? And the stories that they would tell people if we responded like this and they said, you know what? I hated God. I was an atheist. I didn't even give God a chance. But because someone showed me the love of Christ, I made him my Lord. I wanted to find out more about him. See, this is why Jesus asks us to be different, because we can reflect Jesus in our lives to other people. This is what Jesus wants for us. And to show other people that kind of love magnifies who God really is. And so while we, may say things like, well, who would do that, right? Jesus, again, wants us to break the norm. It's not about revenge that comes naturally to us, but it is about mercy and generosity and love. These are the kind of people that Jesus expects us to be in his kingdom. It's not unrealistic. It's not about asking, how can I get even, or what can I do to one-up them? It's about showing up as Jesus in other people's lives. That's what Jesus wants from us. Again, as the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 12, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.